stop sharing my screen in a second here and turn over to Rob Niederhood. Go ahead, Rob.
All right, great. Thank you, James. So welcome everybody to the April 28th meeting of the Environmental Rules Review Committee. Go ahead and call the meeting to order. Hi, everybody. And I'll turn it over to the clerk, Dale Shaw, to take the roll.
Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's meeting. Per the Open Meeting Act requirements, it is noted this meeting of the ERRC is being held electronically. When I call your name for roll call and you are present, please state the county you are attending the meeting from remotely for the meeting minutes. And we'll go ahead and start with Rob Niederhood.
Rob Niederhood, joining from Wayne County.
Okay, and Jeremy Orr.
And Jeremy Orr, joining from Wayne County.
Great. Melissa Stoltz.
Melissa or Missy Stoltz, joining from Washtenaw County.
All right, Eric Pessel.
Hi, Eric Pessel, joining from Barry County.
Great. And Helen Taylor.
This is Helen Taylor. I'm in Benzie County.
Great, thank you. Shayna Berry.
Shayna Berry, joining from Kalamazoo County.
Great. Mary Ellen Mika.
Yep, Mary Ellen Micah, and joining from Ottawa County.
Great. Fadi Murad.
Yes, Fadi Murad, joining from Oakland County.
Grant Trigger. Was Grant Trigger able to join us? Okay. Chuck Lipstrow.
Hi, Chuck Lipstrow, joining from Ingham County.
And Walker Modig.
Walker Modig, joining from Kalamazoo County.
Great, thanks. Is Dave Manis on? Dave Manis?
I don't see him, Dale.
I don't see him. Okay, so Rob, it looks like you have 10 voting members present. I'm also going to do roll call for the non-voting members, which is James Clift.
James Clift here, Ingham County.
Great, and Jim Johnson.
Present, Ingham County.
Great, Trevor Van Dyke.
Trevor's here, Clinton County.
Great, thanks, Trevor. And Gerald Tiernan.
I'm here.
Great, thank you. You have a quorum, Rob. You are all set to go.
All right, thanks, Dale. So moving down the agenda, the next item on the agenda is the approval of the agenda. So everyone received that in advance of the meeting. Entertain a motion to approve the agenda.
So
I move
moved.
to approve.
I'll second that, Rob. Eric Pessel.
Okay, I think I heard Missy, seconded by Eric. All in favor of approving the agenda, say aye.
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 Is opposed? Okay. Next item on the agenda is the approval of the ERRC's minutes from our last meeting on February 18th, 2021. So I'll entertain a motion to approve the minutes from February 18th.
So moved.
Second.
All right. So moved by Helen Taylor, seconded by Fadi Murad. All in favor of approving the minutes from February 18th, say aye.
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 All those opposed? Okay. I think I just saw Grant Trigger join. Are you with us, Grant?
I am, thank you. My
All right.
apologies.
No problem. No problem at all. Welcome. The next item on the agenda is a presentation from Joshua Mosher of the Remediation and Redevelopment Division regarding the draft rules and regulatory impact statement that have been submitted. Rule set 2020-130. So with that, I will turn it over to Joshua for a presentation on the rule set. Joshua, I see you there.
Yep,
All right,
I'm here.
go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.
Joshua Mosier, Assistant Division Director for Remediation and Redevelopment Division within Eagle. Here to talk about the PFAS criteria rule set for Part 201. I do have a slide show here. I'll start. Been having trouble with PowerPoint this morning, but it seems to be working now. So I'm going to share my screen. Should be. Should be working for everybody. Is it up?
Yes, I can see.
Okay, thanks. So first, I just want to talk about the purpose really quickly. The purpose of this rule set is to assure equal protection of drinking water for all Michigan citizens, regardless of their source, whether it's a municipal system or private drinking water wells. And to meet this purpose and objective, these rules provide the basis for identifying hazardous levels of PFAS in the environment, and it'll assist those parties responsible to determine the actions necessary to prevent unacceptable exposure to these hazardous substances. So as this committee is aware, there were state drinking water standards promulgated in August of last year for 7 PFAS. And the state did have 2 criteria for PFOA and PFAS, single and combined, but did not have criteria for the other 5 substances that Safe Drinking Water Act standards were promulgated for, or MCLs. I'll probably go in and out of saying drinking water standards and MCLs, but so these were intended to protect the approximately 7 million drinking water users that rely on municipal systems. So what we're going to go through today is the Part 201 process, which is the environmental cleanup statute, on how we establish groundwater cleanup criterion and take into consideration the state drinking water standards that are developed under the Safe Drinking Water Act. So we'll work through this process today. We'll show you how it was followed and how it's intended to provide equal protection for the additional approximately 3 million citizens of Michigan that rely on groundwater for their drinking water source. So the first part of the process is making a determination that these substances are hazardous substances under the statute. And there's a definition for that. Basically, anything that can pose an unacceptable risk to health, safety, welfare, and the environment. And it takes into consideration fate, dose, toxicity, and other adverse impact on natural resources. So the totality of the evidence supports designating these PFAS as hazardous substance. They have a potential to pose unacceptable risk to the public. They're highly soluble and mobile in the groundwater systems in the environment and are extremely persistent. They can bioaccumulate in humans. And as documented during the course of developing their respective state drinking water standards or MCLs, they have the ability to cause adverse health effects across multiple organ systems, as well as causing reproductive and developmental effects. Therefore, we made the determination, specifically under Part 201 as well, that these PFAS are designated as hazardous substances. So the next step in the process in Part 201 is to calculate or develop a generic criterion following the requirements in Part 201, specifically 201-20A, sub 3, to develop criteria. One thing of note here is that PFOA and PFOS already had established Part 201 criteria prior to promulgation of the MCL. But we did have to calculate criteria for the other 5 PFAS. So there's a few things that go into that. Again, this is all laid out in Part 201, is determining the toxicity, chemical and physical characteristics, and then calculate the generic criteria in accordance with the statute and the rules. The rules have all the algorithms on how to use this information to calculate and develop the criteria. And when we do that, there is a section provision in the statute which directs the department on how to consider the state drinking water established under the Safe Drinking Water Act when we develop a cleanup criterion under Part 201 using the process. And this is the section of the statute. It basically says, and this is very important to note, that if we calculate a groundwater criteria for an aquifer and it differs from, and that's important, differs from one of these other 3 standards, either the State Drinking Water Standard or MCL, a National Secondary Drinking Water Standard regulation, which is typically an aesthetic value. And if there's not a national standard, a state standard for aesthetics that's developed using EPA approved methods. So there are no secondary standards under Category B here, and there are no state standards under Category C. So the only thing we had to look at in this instance to compare the calculated criteria under Part 201 is the state drinking water standards that were promulgated last August. And it says if it differs from those, then the cleanup criterion shall be the most stringent of A, B, or C. So since we only have A, and I will show you in a minute how they differ, the criteria default to the state drinking water standards. And again, it differs. It doesn't matter if it's higher or lower, it only has to differ. And again, that is, the purpose and intent is pretty clear that this is intended to assure that there's, equality or equal protection for both municipal water system users and private well users. There is a corresponding rule also in Part 201 that supports this. Again, we use the algorithms or calculations in the rule set to develop the criterion. And again, it supports the statute, the criteria, and this underlined passage here. The criteria calculated under this sub-rule shall be the generic cleanup criteria unless a state drinking water standard is available or more protective, aesthetic value. So that's what we did. We calculated generic criteria for the 5 PFAS that we did not have generic criteria established for and compared them to the state drinking water standards or MCL in accordance with Part 201. And here's the results. So this has actually all 7 of them on there, including PFOA and PFOS. We calculated residential and non-residential. Just to note that this table is in parts per billion versus parts per trillion because our generic rule set for table uses parts per billion instead of parts per trillion. But you can see across the board they differ. They're not all lower and they're not all higher, and some of them are pretty close to each other, but that's basically irrelevant at this point because they do differ. So since they differ, we have to rely on the statutory language that says it shall be the state drinking water standard, which is on the right-hand column. So, PFOA and PFOS would in effect when the state drinking water standards or MCLs were promulgated. that was an automatic effect since there were already calculated values for those two. We published those new criteria on our website, I believe, right on August 3rd or 4th when they came out. So the other five. So the other five that we had to calculate criteria for, what we did is we held a couple of public information sessions. This is not something that the statute requires, but for transparency, we thought it was good to walk people through what we did during the process. There was a little more detail. We walked through the process as we're walking here on November 2nd. Once we had and verified and did all our QA/QC on the values that we came up with, we held another public information session on November 16th to kind of walk people through the science a little bit and how we came up with the values. So we held, and we took public comment after that. So we accepted written comments from interested parties through December 17th, or sorry, December 7th for consideration. And after review of those comments and questions, we determined that, while they were good comments and questions, none of them really gave us the ability or showed us that we did not follow the law, which strictly states that, again, if our calculations differ from the MCLs, that they should be the MCLs. So we ended up publishing generic criteria for the other 5 PFAS in accordance with the statute. That's a requirement on December 15th, 2020. So those went into effect at that time. But there's more to the process, and that's why we're here today. So it says, well, we can publish those criteria and they become enforceable and effective upon publishing. We have to, within 30 days, initiate the rulemaking process. And that's what we did in January 11th of this year. We submitted our request for rulemaking on that date. Then we did then follow up with a draft rule and the regulatory impact statement on April 6th and 7th of this year. And so we met our 30-day time frame. These documents were approved by the Michigan Office of Administrative Hearings and Rules. And we're at the next step of the process, which is meeting with the Environmental Rules Review Committee and run this through the rule promulgation process. And so this is pretty close to the end of the presentation. So the next steps here are, we have effective and enforceable criteria until the rule process plays out, and either it's replaced by a different rule, we withdraw with the request, or the time limitation runs out or is not met. All right. And that's it. So that's where we are today. Again, so just to summarize, we did follow the process precisely under Part 201 to calculate criteria for the PFAS substances that have MCLs. They did differ from those MCLs, so the statute dictates that we use the more stringent of the other categories. We actually don't ever go back to the calculated value. Since it differs, we automatically have to use one of those other 3 options, which again are only the MCLs, and those become the criterion. And those were published in accordance with the statute as well, and rulemaking was initiated within the timeframes necessary to follow the process. So that's where we are today. And I guess that's the end of the presentation period. So I guess we're at time for questions, probably. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Joshua. Appreciate the presentation. Dale, I'm not sure how we want to handle questions. If you want to, I guess I can see hands raised as well as anybody.
We could ask those during the deliberation process. I guess, if you want to do it that way, or if it's directly related to the presentation, you could do those now as well.
Yeah, and maybe what I'll do is, so if you remember from our last meeting, I noted I was going to recuse myself. My firm requested that I do this from discussion on this rule set. So Eric, if you're ready for me to kind of hand things off to you as the vice chair, and you can kind of handle the questioning and the next couple items on the agenda as well. I think now would probably be a good time to do that.
That sounds good, Rob.
Okay, thanks, Eric.
Yep. And, there we go. Dale, did you say we should go ahead and get some questions? If we had questions on the presentation itself, we can ask them now.
Yes, if you'd like, or if it's really opening up to question and answer from the whole department, let's put that off to the deliberation part and do the public comment period first.
Okay, I did have a question on the presentation. I think, Joshua, you answered it at the very end, but I just want to make sure I understood. Because you said that you were going to go in and out using MCL and I think it was state drinking water. So, and I think that's where the confusion comes in. But basically, if the standards are different, you shall use the more stringent of the standard, correct?
Yes, if the calculated value that we develop using the Part 201 environmental remediation statute process differs from the state drinking water standard, which is the MCL, or the two aesthetic values, which there are no values for, we have to use the most stringent of one of the other three. We don't actually go back to the calculated value.
Okay, so
we calculate under 201. We have to choose one of the other three if they exist.
And only one exists. That's the MCL or the state drinking water standard.
Correct.
So by default, that's why it goes back to this. Okay, I understand.
Correct.
Thank you.
Correct. Yep.
Yep. Is there a way for me, Dale, to see who else has a hand up? Grant, you have your hand up. Take yourself off mute, Grant.
Thank you for that guidance. And I apologize for the screen. I'm in a different location, so I'm not intending to be a screened protected witness with this call. I have a couple of questions, but I'm not sure, Dale, whether it goes directly to the presentation or some other issues. So would you prefer to wait or?
Yeah, why don't we, let's wait, Grant, especially if it might go to other members of Eagle besides just Jocelyn.
Thank you.
Grant, if you could also, just so we can keep it straight, go ahead and lower your hand for now. And then I won't keep calling on you.
Got it.
Okay, so I think, Dale, where we're at is the public comment period. Is there an intro that you need to give here? Oh, sorry. Hang on. Did I miss a hand, Helen?
You're on mute, Helen.
Sorry, I don't know which it falls into. It was just to clarify, by reading through all the materials, which is including the presentation, it struck me as this is really very familiar ground, the same information. Nothing was new or unexpected or changed that I could tell from the previous iterations of language and application of the rules, etc. And I just wanted to confirm that we're really revisiting, kind of after you've gone through this whole public process, where we are now. So maybe this is a deliberation question, but it looked like nothing had changed and it was not new, and that helps me because then I am.
Yeah, correct. Nothing has changed since we started talking to the public in November, and then when we met back in, was it February or January? Nothing has changed.
Okay.
On the process.
Good. So.
Okay. All right. so Dale, let's go ahead and put up the public comment. And do you take it from here, Dale, for this?
Yeah, I can assist with this part. Just checking, can you see my screen for the
Yes.
public comment? Okay, perfect. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start with those who'd like to make a comment that is participating via the Teams meeting. If you want to provide a comment, raise your hand by clicking on the raise your hand icon in the Teams toolbar and type, or if you want, type your name in the chat box. When your name is called, you can go ahead and start providing your comments by stating your name and any group association you may represent. And we're going to try and keep it to about 3 minutes for each comment. And then after we do the Teams function comment, if there's anybody calling in by the phone that would like to make a comment, we will go to them next. So at this time, I'm looking for anyone that wishes to make a comment via Teams. If you would like to go ahead and raise your hand or unmute your microphone. Okay, I am not seeing anybody raising their hands or typing in a comment. Is there anybody that has called in that would like to provide a comment? All right. I'm going to say this concludes our public comment section of the meeting.
Dale, there was a comment.
Oh, was there? Where? I'm sorry.
If you open the chat.
Oh, thank you.
You're
I'm
welcome.
so sorry. My thing did not indicate this. I'm glad you said something. Stephen Inns stated Eagle presented development of drinking water criteria. What about the soil protective criteria and other 201 criteria? Direct contact. So that is the comment from Stephen. Any other comments? Thank you, Stephanie, for catching that. Okay, at this time, I think I'm going to pass it back to you, Eric.
Okay, it looks to me like we are moving into our deliberation of our members. And I think how we've done this in the past is we've just kind of opened it up for people to, if you have questions or if you have questions, further questions that maybe Joshua can't answer, there's other folks here that maybe can. I don't remember if we had this really defined. Rob, I don't think it's really a defined process, right?
No, I think, yeah, we basically gave every member an opportunity to speak and ask questions and until everybody was satisfied, and then I think move to the vote from there.
Okay. All right. So I'll open up the floor for anybody that has wanted to make a comment or questions of any of the staff that are here today. Grant, do you want the floor?
Sure, I can be happy to start. I have really a general comment to begin with, and then I think 3 points I'd like to raise. First is, I think to Helen's point, fundamentally, we really already crossed this path in August when the MCLs were adopted. And so I think the mere adoption of these numbers isn't really problematic or really the point right now. I think Joshua's done a nice job on the public meetings and explaining the process. But there are a couple things that, and I think one of the comments that showed up in the chat goes to it, which is the secondary impacts of this action. When we adopted the MCLs initially, one of the observations from the department was, well, we don't know what other sites might be affected by these rules. And a few months later, there was a mass of sites added to the MPART list. And I think that in transparency purposes, the other implications from these rules are adopting these numbers rather are worthy of some discussion, I think. The first is the Eagle just adopted in March a guidance document for land application of biosolids, which acknowledged several things, that up to 20,000 parts per trillion of PFAS can be land applied with no limits on that application, other than the number of dry tons per acre. And in addition to that, implied that higher levels could also be applied. And one of the things that we floated out with respect to these issues is, what are these criteria, what bearing do these criteria have for drinking water have on other criteria? And I've been struggling to find the language and the rules, and I go back about 25 years in this process, maybe 30, so my memory isn't always clear exactly where things are. But we adopted many years ago a 20 times groundwater number as a threshold value in soils, which would indicate that if you adopt 6 parts per trillion as the drinking water standard for PFNA, that the soil standard would be 120 parts per trillion. And in the case of PFOS and PFOA, there's published numbers by the department that indicate in the case of soil, the PFOS standard would be 240 parts per trillion, and the PFOA for drinking water source would be 350. And what's not clear to me is, and I don't know, Joshua, Dale had asked for some questions in advance, so I had shared these earlier this week, whether this is on Joshua's plate or someone else from the department, because we kind of touched on this a couple of times, and it's still not really clear to me whether we can expect, once these numbers are adopted, that the soil standard for PFHXS, for example, would be 1,000 parts per trillion. So it would be helpful if we could get some clarity on that. The other comment I have is, and it's always unclear to me when we get a regulatory impact statement whether it's really a topic for review and comment, but there's one statement in here, and there's sort of a trend in this regulatory impact statement to say, well, the benefits of these rules are really obvious. We really don't know what the burdens might be, so we can't talk about the burdens. And in one place, that's kind of, I think it would be fair to say there will be burdens. We've demonstrated that already. There are burdens, not necessarily inappropriate burdens, but there will be burdens. And there's a statement in question 28 that makes the statement that since the same treatment technology can be used to address all 7 PFAS, the department does not anticipate that additional actions should be required above and beyond those already required by the presence of PFOA and PFOS. In my view, that statement is a serious oversimplification. And because I believe it is true that the short chain, well, I know it's true, the short chain PFAS are harder to treat. And you may not be able to successfully treat the shorter PFAS with the same technology you treat the longer chain PFAS. So there's a little bit of inconsistencies, I think, in a downplaying of some of the burdens from these rules, and the question of whether it will impact soil standards. So I know that's a fair amount of background, Eric, but I had to put a little bit of it in context. And I want to make it clear, this isn't questioning whether these should go forward. I think it's just fair and appropriate to understand the full implications of them being adopted. Thank you.
Joshua or anybody
Yeah.
from Eagle, would you like to?
No, I can start off, and I'll probably hand it off at some point here, or somebody kicks me virtually under the table. But yeah, Grant, we got your questions here. So I guess I don't know where that 240 and 350 come from specifically for drinking water, but at this time, our focus is on the groundwater, as you stated, for the sole purpose of making sure that we have equal protection for groundwater use. Now, Yeah, we do have a category of criteria for soil related to the drinking water pathway, but at this time we are not developing soil criteria. We understand that there's a lot that goes into this. There's a lot of science. Whether the 20 times standard is applicable or not, or makes sense for PFAS, we really want to understand that first. So I think we're being diligent in not rushing into anything there. So at this time, we're not applying that standard, and we're not developing soil criteria or proposing it. The biosolids, I can speak to a little bit. I may have to hand that off to Abby, but the biosolid numbers are just that. They're for biosolids. They do not represent criteria in soil, because biosolids are not soil. And there's still some, the guidance will evolve over time based on what we know about how that stuff, will leach out and impact. But I'm not the expert in that, but I do want to make it clear that at this point, facilities will be defined by the presence of PFAS in the groundwater above the groundwater criteria. There is not an applicable soil criteria at this point. And Abby, if you want to expand on the biosolids, please feel free.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. Abby Hendershot. I'm the executive director for MPART, taking over for Steve Sliver. So thank you for having me. Just to expand on that, yeah, the biosolids is an interim strategy designed to mitigate and reduce PFAS concentrations coming into wastewater treatment plants and then getting into biosolids. So if we see a biosolids concentration of over 20 parts per billion, then we want those plants to start taking additional actions to reduce those concentrations. And remember that, as Josh said, biosolids aren't soils, but they are applied to fields at agronomic rates where we end up with about a 400 time dilution into the soils. And so based on the studies that we've done so far, we don't see a direct correlation to applying at that rate and any kind of groundwater contamination. But that being said, as Josh says, we want to follow the science. We want to make sure we understand what the leachability are of all of these PFAS, and make sure that we don't move faster than what the science is really telling us. So, did that answer the question?
Yeah, that's very helpful, Abby. And by the way, welcome to your new responsibilities. You have a legacy to fulfill from Mr. Silva.
Thank you, Grant.
I did have a follow-up on the, do you see the timing of the leachate review that's being done right now? And I know Dale Bradford was working on that. I think it was Dale. Do you have a forecast of when you think this stuff will be moving forward on the soils? And to Joshua's point, if you're not applying 20 times now, waiting for better information, do you have a sense of when that's maybe going to come together?
We're about halfway through the collection process, but we want to get that initial set of data and then go out. So right now they've done the rural and the forested lands, and then we have to reach out to get appropriate sample sites for urban and rural urban type of properties. And so we're still looking at the best way to do that, because there's a lot of implications with that. So I would expect, I'm hopeful that we would have something by the end of the year, but I doubt it'd be much earlier than that.
It's a lot of work.
It is.
Appreciate the point. Thank you.
I really want to make sure we take the time to do it right, and make sure that the state has the appropriate information to make good decisions, because PFAS, as we know, there's a lot of different chemicals. They all have different 4 chains, 6 chains, 8 chains on up. Those all act a little bit differently, and the potential to leach, I don't think we can necessarily lump all together. So we need to understand that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And Eric, that responds to my main points. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. I have a quick question, I think, for Joshua. And maybe I missed this before, maybe back earlier this year, but what definition are you using for groundwater?
What definition are we using for groundwater?
Yeah.
Is there one in the, maybe Patty can help me here. Is there one in the statute actually?
There is actually a definition in the statute for groundwater, and it's water below the ground surface. But when we talk about the criteria here for the drinking water, it's in an aquifer or in groundwater that is connected to an aquifer.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it goes on to say aquifer connection to the aquifer.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anybody else? I don't see any hands raised. Does any of our members have any clarifying? Jeremy?
Hey, yep. Thanks everyone. Kind of just going back to with Helen and Grant had mentioned that the criteria are essentially identical to what were previously proposed. Feels like Josh and Eagle did their due diligence and found it fit not to change anything with the proposed criteria as well as the existing legally enforceable criteria. I also think it's important or significant at least to acknowledge that we didn't have any sort of public comment requesting a delay here today, and as we've seen throughout this PFAS process, stakeholders have been well organized and vocal with their concerns at various points throughout the process. I think that's important, and I'd love to see us advance these final rules today and create a sense of certainty for the rules and compliance moving forward.
Okay, thank you, Jeremy. Fadi, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Actually, I have a question, and maybe Josh would maybe able to help with that. In question 10, basically, it's more about the fiscal impact on the agency with respect to that. And the statement says that the proposed rules will be implementing using existing resources. Now, granted that those criteria are generic cleanup criteria, but knowing that they are more reflective of the drinking water standard and not the calculated one. So they're more stringent than otherwise they would be, and for a good reason. The question is that if local governments or agencies or even private developers, as they go through and wanting to clean up their site, basically they qualified as a facility and they need to clean up. Is there a possibility that more will be going to a risk-based type analysis or risk assessment that could put undue review on the agency since the criteria are much more stringent than otherwise calculated?
I'm sure. Yeah, I mean,
that standpoint, and the prevalence of PFAS. I mean, you write up through here that there's the prevalence of PFAS and it's existing in the state is a lot. So I'm wondering whether that will cause any burden on the agency itself to process all these site-specific things if some elected to move away from the generic.
Yes. There is the ability, someone always has the ability to propose a site-specific criteria and justify and defend the factors and the information they use to do that, but it requires department approval. We would have to review and approve and agree to that. So so that is always an option. The use of the generic criteria, are less of a burden on the department at that point, but it would require more time and resources from us to review those. We get some of those occasionally for other pathways, other hazardous substances and things of that nature. So we do it on occasion. It's not that prevalent in the program. So there is that option, but yes, you're right. It takes more time and resources because they do have to be reviewed and approved by EGLE.
Yeah, you still believe that it can be covered under existing resources? You're not going to need.
It really depends until people, implemented. It's really hard to say whether somebody's going to try to go for a site-specific, groundwater cleanup for drinking water. And, again, maybe Eric can speak to the complexities of that. And, but again, we would have to use our existing resources. That's what I'm saying. And we have the people to do it. So, I mean, if 30 of them came in a day, maybe not, but that's not likely, I don't think.
All right, thanks, Fadi. Helen, did you have a question?
Yeah, or maybe it's more of an observation, but consistent with my first question is it the same? So there's nothing unexpected. I think it's, I reflect on what Jeremy said. I think, the comments, everything that has happened to date, it's in a move forward place. I'm noticing the comments and I'm listening and learning. We're eager. A lot of the questions have to do with the muscle tone that has to be built as we apply rules. It's, well, what will it happen? Well, we won't know until we start doing this. How to interpret it? Will it actually take more for the chemicals that are later on the list, as Grant was saying? Well, will it take more capacity from the agencies? So I think those are all telling me the rules are in a good place, that the rest of it we will learn by doing. And like any great piece of legislation, it gets adapted as we learn along the way. And I think the sooner we can get to those things, we will maybe not worry as much about things, because we'll be actually actively able to learn from that and adapt as we go and amend. So with all of that, I think I'm in the same camp that it would be a shame if we didn't move these forward. So I'm just advocating for us to do that so that we can get to learning and adapting and adjusting in the process of applying rules that are really needed.
Okay. Yeah, I don't think that was a question, right, Helen? That was just a statement. I will move.
Be right.
Shayna, you had your hand up?
Yes, I kind of want to, agree with the rule process, understanding where we are and what has come before and what needs to be done. And I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment also, but when you look at the impact statement, going back to, we've kind of mentioned any of the costs or any of the burdens, and maybe it's going the other way, Helen, from the other way of how much do we need to know before we move forward, or how much is helpful to know. I'm not implying that impedes us from moving forward today, but in the long run, maybe as an outsider reading an impact statement, I would assume there'd be some actual numbers of cost before you put in a rule of at least a broad range of who, if there's 154 potential sites, there has to be some range of, and I'm not an expert in this type of thing, but are we talking about $1 million a piece for each one of those 154 places? And I know it varies, or $50,000 a location, and how much of that is publicly owned or public owned municipalities or areas, or how much of that is private. I guess that's my comment in the impact statements. I think those are very important details to dig into, to know as you move something forward, just to get the whole gauge of what you're doing. I guess that's more of a comment. Thank you.
I would just ask Eagle if you want to take that as a comment, or does anybody want to take that as a question and maybe?
Well, I mean, I can respond if you want.
Yeah.
We did recognize that there would be impacts, that there would be increased costs, that that those responsible for the release of hazardous substances and and the state who's responsible for also protecting people from those, that there are costs. And I think we did share what we've spent to date researching, looking into, and responding to PFAS and PFAS releases. But quantification of that is really dependent, again, on the complexity of your release, what you intend to do, whether you tend to actually clean it up or just capture it, or restrict the groundwater use because there's no drinking water wells in the area, or if you have to put in municipal water. So it's really hard to predict it's really hard to quantify. We recognize that there is additional costs, and but again, they don't incur any differently than somebody who releases, TCE or some other hazardous substance. It depends on where the receptors are, who it affects, how large it is, what the concentration, what the complexities are. So it's not like there's no standard approach to say, yep, you have to check this every year. It's $20,000 to operate this, and it's, here's your analytical, and we can ballpark it. It ranges from maybe the cost of a restrictive covenant to put in place to, multi-million-dollar sites. It just really depends. And so we tried not to pretend like we knew the cost. And we don't get all that information necessarily to know what private parties are expending actually to do this work. Get that information readily. So we recognize that it will place additional burdens and costs. Quantification is not something that easily calculated.
Thank you.
Okay, I see. Before I go to Missy, Helen, you raised your hand again. Did you have something again? Did something come back to mind?
Well, yeah, it was just I totally understand what Shana was saying, and that's some folks were not present during some of those earlier conversations, and so all I wanted to offer in response was there were a couple of meetings where you guys did talk about costs, and there were some really meaningful moments of learning for me, because I am not an expert, but I thought I'd offer those. One was, in many instances, the way it was characterized and shared with us, there are entities, there was a school example in one instance where the real desire is to get them to connect to the municipal water supply, and they just hadn't. So in fact, there are options that probably should have been acted on long ago in some places to get them off the contaminated exposure path. And that's the real driver. And so they spoke to that. And there actually was a number of back and forth talking about the types of costs. But one really important line, and a lot of that just didn't show up in this document we read, but I remember being educated through that process. And a lot of that gave me that comfort that it wasn't a complete blind spot, that you had thought about it. I think another key characteristic was, and in working with corporations, this is always really important, that there's not any unfair disadvantage to people in a marketplace. So as long as something is evenly applied, clarity is really what people want more than anything, and that it is evenly applied. So that made a difference too. That I saw in the document, but a lot of that other stuff, it didn't really find its way into this document we read for the meeting, but more was offered earlier, if that makes any difference. I just wanted to share that.
All right. Thank you, Helen. Missy.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And Joshua, thank you for your response to that. And Helen, the extra nuance that you just added is really important, because I was kind of working through that in my head, trying to recollect all the details. I wanted to second what Jeremy kind of elevated. And as we think about kind of the costs, the two things that stand out are we didn't require people to report PFAS contamination for a long time. So we just don't have all of that rich data. And then what we do have are examples. And so that's what I think Helen was referencing. And that gives us some insight, but it's not the universe. And so it gets really tricky to quantify the cost. The other thing we don't have are the public health costs, because we're learning about the impacts of PFAS too. And so I just want to elevate that. I think it is, and I'm not projecting that anyone said this, but I think what we're learning is that the public health costs are far greater than what we even anticipated, especially with the persistent compound that's being found everywhere in the world at the moment. So I want to elevate that we're not getting cost holistically in this space, not just cost to implement, but cost of non-action as well. And that's not a critique. That's just a reality of the science and what we're learning.
Thank you for that clarification, Missy. Mary Ellen, did you have?
Yes, yeah, thank you. So I just have two questions. They're just practical questions. So do we have existing data for those 7 compounds and, the actual concentrations of the PFOA and PFAS and the related compounds at very many of these sites in the groundwater? Do we know what we're talking about? Okay. I see you nodding, Abby.
Yeah, we're, those 7 compounds are part of our typical scan of 24, 28, in some cases 30 different compounds that we have been analyzing for as part of the drinking water method. And so they're being analyzed across the state, but they're not drivers. The drivers are going to continue to be PFOS and PFOA. And so we do occasionally find PFBS as a kind of a lone wolf out there by itself with nothing else associated with it. But that's not very typical. For the most part, you know, the sites that we have the most concerns with are those that have, you know, the much more elevated levels of PFOS and PFOA. And then in our fish, PFOS continues to be the driver. So that's where we've spent most of our focus. But yeah, good question. All of the lab data is done for all of the compounds.
Okay, thanks. And then second question, is there any technology that's known other than activated charcoal for trying to clean it up from groundwater?
Yeah, there's a lot of work going into treatment technologies across the state. We've got a treatment technology work group that's working on that, and had a PFAS summit last year that generated 1,300 people from, you know, around the world to talk about treatment technologies. And there is some, I'm getting research and development people calling me daily about, they think they've got some microbes that'll start actually breaking it down and not leaving residuals that are more toxic than what the precursors were. But, you know, proof's in the pudding. We're going to wait and see if that all develops, but the bench scale tests at least look like they're promising. So my hope is that this is one of the areas where Michigan continued to lead the nation in trying to promote treatment technologies, because this, you know, we sorely need it. Our landfills need it, our wastewater treatment plants need it. And so we've been not only promoting it through the summit, but also through some, you know, cooperation with our local universities as well.
Thank you.
Okay, Fadi, you had your hand up. Was that just?
Yeah, yeah, Mary Ellen, and thank you for that. She touched on it. It's more related to technology, but maybe I'll ask just one last question regarding that. Is carbon can be used successfully to treat all the compounds that we have criteria for, or because each compound has, my understanding, different absorption on carbon, and I'm wondering whether you can still do it in for all 7 compounds.
Yeah. So I mean, do you want to take this one? I mean, here's what I know. I mean, carbon. There are, you know, carbon's been looked at a lot, and you know, there's studies, and EPA has lots of information. We have information too that, yeah, the carbon can be used on all of these. The longer chains are more readily absolved, and the sulfonates are more readily absorbed than the acids. So, you know, but carbon can be used, but there's also resins that are being developed specifically for PFAS that can do some ion exchange, and there's some reverse osmosis techniques, but carbon can treat it. But, you know, PFOA and PFOS will probably absorb more readily and take up the space. So more carbon might have to be utilized to hit all the compounds, or some polishing at the end, or maybe something else. But I mean, right now, it's mostly pump and treat the groundwater to kind of capture it and run it through some kind of media. And like the carbon can get to it, but it's like anything. It's the more mass you have, you know, you can remove a lot, but can you get it down to the last couple parts per trillion? And so you may have to, you know, add something else to finish it off. But carbon can treat all of these, just at different absorption rates.
Is the carbon then sent to a landfill, or is it desorbed at some point? And
depends on the manufacturer. They're doing, you know, each manufacturer has got their own process for it. And so some of it's going to landfills. I think some of it, they were trying to do some incineration or even try to reactivate it. But, you know, I don't know that we have a ton of I don't have a ton of insight on that particular thing. I will say, to add on to what Josh was saying, at least with the North Kent with Wolverine, where we had terrifically high groundwater concentrations in people's homes, where they had, 6 and 8 different carbon canisters in the house. And in one particular house, we had 96,000 parts per trillion in somebody's drinking water. The carbon was successful in taking out all of the contamination. Now, they had a lot of carbon on it. And so you'd always want to make sure you're checking for breakthrough, but it is a proven technology. Is it the best solution in all situations? That remains to be seen. So.
Thank you, Ed. Appreciate it. Thanks, Josh.
Okay, Grant, do you have your hand up again?
Yeah, just a little follow-up. 2 things. First, I think that I appreciate the observations from both Joshua and Abby about sort of the perspective on how to address some of these things. I think that was a...
Oops.
Oh, something happened there. But that was, I think, came across fairer than how I read the regulatory impact statement. The second thing is, I just make an observation. We started looking at 1,4-dioxane issues about 7 years ago. And at that time, nobody had a method to treat 1,4-dioxane for bioremediation purposes. And yet you can do that today. So really, to Abby's point about the amount of research that's going on and looking at other technologies, it could be 5, it could be 10 years. We'll have better technologies as we go forward. But yeah. Carbon's the one thing that will work. It's just when you get into other complications, it just becomes a compounded problem to deal with the various PFAS. And I think, and one point I wanted to come back to one of Helen and Jeremy's observations about PFAS generally. When the list initially came out about looking at other potential PFAS, I know a number of organizations, including some we work with, who long before the drinking water standards were adopted and long before these rules came to the table, those other compounds were already being evaluated. And I think, as Joshua said, some of the PFAS respond differently in carbon, but if you're facing the prospect of having PFHXS, for example, become a regulated substance, you better make sure the system you're looking at not only removes PFOS and PFOA, but it also is managing PFHXS. And that's just the nature of this beast right now. And the last point I would make is Abby's comment about, some things, and Joshua's, it's just some things are just going to take longer to figure out. And that's appreciated because we're in the midst of that, and it's going to take time.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Okay, last call. Does anybody have any more comment or questions? Going once, going twice. All right, I think we're able to move on to a vote on the draft rule. Dale, do we need to go through their options, or how are we going to proceed for the vote?
So for the next step, we just have to make sure that the rule, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, just have to consider the draft proposed rule meets all of the following criteria, which the MOAR has already certified the first step. So you just have to go through the last 4, and then we can look at the different voting criteria.
I guess, are you looking for, how about if we said, does anybody have any issues with any of the 4 criteria of this not meeting any of those 4? If you do, speak your piece now. Dale, I think we can move forward.
All right.
Can I ask one question? Sorry. My only concern remains the fact that I think we don't necessarily know the burdens that these place on individuals and businesses. But having said that, I wouldn't stand in the way of moving forward with the approval.
Okay. All right. So if we are all in agreement for this slide, then we have 3 options. Oops, just a second. We have 3 options. A, which is by a vote of 9 members, we can request that this rule set does not proceed any further under the ERC section of statute, and it can proceed to normal rulemaking procedures, which would mean that after the public hearing process, this rule set would not come back to the ERC for a second review. As we previously said, we would off-ramp it here. The second selection is by a majority vote. We can continue on that the draft rule meets the criteria and can proceed to the public hearing. But in this option, it would come back to the ERC after the public hearing phase. And then the last section, letter C, by a majority vote, either the draft rules does not meet the criteria that we just reviewed in subsection 4, or you need additional time to determine whether it meets the criteria. So if we have a motion for either of those, I do have slides on the wording that we used in previous meetings as well, if you'd like to see those.
So I would throw it out there. Does anybody want to make a motion and choose one of the 3 choices?
Well, may I ask a question first?
Yeah.
I know I looked at this before, but I'm confused between A and B. A goes to and return to normal rulemaking procedures under the APA. By majority vote, proceeds to a public hearing under section 66.
Yeah, so the differences are going to be this. The normal rulemaking process, or letter A, doesn't include the ERC process. So if we were to determine that we voted A, then the next step in the rulemaking process would be going to the hearings phase, and then the rule set would be prepared for the JCAR package and move forward that route. But when we choose option B, then we proceed back to section 66, which is the ERC section in the Administrative Procedures Act. So in this selection, you would option that after the public hearing phase, we would prepare a package for the ERC, come back and have a meeting with the ERC to take a vote to proceed again, and then we would move on to the JCAR stage of the rulemaking process. So it just really depends if you want to come back and review the rule again and see the
So then A is the true off-ramp out of this process. B requires to come back. How many members do we have available to vote today?
We have enough for 9 right now.
So if somebody abstained, there wouldn't be 9 votes.
Nope, we do have, I believe, 10 members present. If I am missing my count, even if Missy is not present, which I'm not sure if she was able to continue on or not, I believe we still had 9 if 1 person abstained.
So let me, in the spirit of
Missy, you are here.
In the spirit of collegiality, let me make an observation. I was anticipating abstaining because I did that with the MCLs. But I'm interested in feedback from the group, and I think I know what that is, that the group probably wants to go A. And it sounds to me like if we're going to go A, I have to vote in the affirmative.
Well, with Missy here, I do believe you can choose to abstain as well. And that would still give us 9.
So to Dale and the Robert and Eric, whoever is the parliamentarian.
Yeah. He froze up.
Did he freeze up?
He froze up. Oh, God.
Have him vote last.
9. Oh, shit.
There he is.
Yeah. I'm the last vote. I'll vote yes. If you've got 9, I'll abstain, because I think that would be consistent with the concerns that I expressed in August. So That's what I'm trying to understand here. If the will of the group is to go A, I don't want to obstruct it, is the bottom line.
So Eric, in the spirit of asking for a motion, I move for A. And Grant, thank you for clarifying, because I thought B was the off ramp and I would have had it wrong. So I move for A.
And I think Dale, that's the, what you have up there right now.
Yes, that is the language for the motion for section A, subsection A.
Do I have a second?
Second.
I'm sorry. Who was that?
Jeremy.
Oh, thanks, Jeremy.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded, second, I think that's a word. Any further discussion? If not, Dale, is this a roll call?
Yes, I would like to do roll call for notes, please.
Okay. Proceed.
Okay. So for motion on the table, Rob. I know you're going to abstain, but do you want to?
I'm abstaining from the vote.
Okay. Jeremy Orr.
Yes, in favor.
Okay. Melissa.
Yes.
Okay. Eric.
Yes.
Helen.
Yes.
Gina.
Yes.
Mary Ellen.
Yes.
Fadi.
Yes.
Grant.
Am I the last?
No.
We don't have 9 positive votes.
Okay, I'll come back to you. Chuck.
Yes.
Walker.
Yes.
We have 9. Grant.
If we have 9 votes, I will abstain. Thank you.
All right. Motion has 9 votes.
Okay. Well, since we got through that difficult part, I'm gonna throw it back to you, Rob.
Sure, give me the tough job, Eric. Well, thank you for your capable service leading us through that discussion.
Rob, I do have one comment before before you close us out. I just want to tell everybody thank you for an hour and 17 minutes of my time that's not focused on COVID. I really appreciate it.
We could make it last longer, Eric.
I don't have much more time, but okay.
No, by the way, I have 2 kids who are on the front line. One works in a medical doctor's office running the lab, and another is in a women's support recovery facility in Pennsylvania and Maryland. And I have a great deal of respect for anybody who does what they can to battle COVID and withstands the unsupported view that masks and other things are inappropriate or not effective. It's not about taking care of yourself. It's about taking care of everybody else. And so thank you for your service, Eric.
Yeah, thank you for that, Grant. Okay, Rob, back to you, buddy.
Thanks, Eric. So with that, we're to the last item on the agenda, adjournment. So anyone want to make a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Seconded.
Seconded. All in favor, say aye.
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 All right, the meeting is adjourned. We will hopefully see everybody in May. We'll be in touch with more details before then, but thanks everybody for joining today, and stay safe, and we will talk soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Hey, Grant, real quick, what county are you calling in from?
What county is Grant calling in from?
Yes.
For the meeting minutes.
Yeah, for the minutes.
I don't know where I am. I'm in Oakland County.
Oakland, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Grant.